Howdy y'all, I am Ice Gold, and oh boy, standard mode of the nightmare has been a topic of controversy as of late. For something that's been considered to be standard, it sure doesn't feel like there's much that's really that much easier than challenge mode, at least in terms of accessibility to your average player. With my strat and other optimal strats that are out, you know, there's pack gear involved, a mid-level deck from a side activity that only runs once a month, rare and expensive treasure cards, jewels you can't craft, stats you need to have or you won't kill bosses, and that's just for the boss fights themselves. There's definitely credit to be given to the people who designed the dungeon itself. At face value, this is like nothing Wiz has ever done before, and it was a super creative idea with unique mechanics that added a layer of depth to the dungeon. However, the people actually playing through it go a little deeper than face value. Some of these new mechanics add a barrier to entry that really doesn't belong in standard mode, and others just outright make me wish I was farming Eon of Atavis. To start things off, the solo fights. I guess they're not really solo anymore, but for having as much health as they do, having these weird counters to specific hanging effects is a bit odd. This aspect wasn't popular in challenge mode because of all the Rochambeau rules on top of it, but in standard you actually see some aspects that weren't even in challenge mode, like climb and hanging effects, and most notably the Drover mob will pop your aura, stripping you of a very desirable buff when there's really not much else you can use to buff up your hits without your buffs getting like enfeebled or whatever. It's sort of trial and error, trying to figure out what you can and can't use in those fights. And they are just mobs, you know. They're mobs with a lot of health, and I don't know. I guess I just don't really feel great about these kinds of cheats applying to mobs that are literally just guarding the gate. It's like you can't even get into the dungeon without beating them. So next, there's the maze. It's no smaller than the challenge mode maze, and it's really not any less annoying. The two bosses are at either side of the maze, and with the dream water pumps being on either side, you're sort of forced to choose if you'd rather four-man the bosses and make someone run all the way back through the maze to find the other pump once the second boss is done, or if you'd rather avoid that and leave someone behind and just three-man the second boss, which then makes that harder. And, you know, there's no timer in standard mode, and while that's a good thing, I also kind of don't want to be here forever farming, and that's kind of the main reason why people didn't like Eon of Atavis, because it's like the polymorph phase, right? It took forever, and like it was averaging out to about 20 minutes a run, so a slow farm is just not going to be popular, and especially with having to beat Malice, 25 times. It's like the other bosses are, I think, 10 for Montgomery and Freddy, 15 for the Invader Fleets, and then 20 for Crash, but Crash makes sense. Making this badge 25 times beating Malice, I guess I just don't really think making the dungeon this complicated, especially in standard mode, is really that great of an idea, because people want to get their gear before the next world drops next fall, so maybe that's too much to ask for, I guess. Third up, there's the Broken Dreams, and as I said before, it's a cool and creative idea, but in practice, trying to deal with them makes me want to paint my walls red. The maze is already confusing enough, but you can't even get your bearings because you need to dodge the Broken Dreams as you go along. Those of you who watch my raid highlights know that the wisps of misfortune that you see in there are incredibly dangerous and can mess up runs by, draining your mana or sending you to jail at a pivotal moment, and it's sort of the same thing with the Broken Dreams, except they will always kick you back to the main area and drain 2,000 of your health and around 20% of your mana if they so much as touch you, and they also move a lot faster than wisps, and they have a tendency to corner you too, so oftentimes you won't even be able to react if one randomly switches direction and comes towards you. And, speaking of that, here's a clip from one of my friends looking for tokens in the south area of the Crying Sky raid, trying to stay behind a wisp when it suddenly switches direction and jails him. It doesn't even look like it does, but it did. And what's worse is, and this also very much applies to the Broken Dreams, there's server side, meaning there's a desync between when a wisp or a dream turns and when you can actually see them turn and react. And then obviously reacting, there's desync there too, so go crazy, I guess. Depending on your ping to the server you're playing on, it can be significantly harder to navigate the maze to deal with them, And this issue is exacerbated by the fact that the broken dreams are, I want to say, at least 3 times faster than the wisps of misfortune that you see in raids. If you're from, Japan or South Africa or Turkey, Peru, New Zealand, even rural Canada with awful internet, just to give some examples from every continent, you're going to have a significantly harder time dealing with the broken dreams than you would if you lived close to the servers and had good internet. And hey, I fit into both of those boxes and they still regularly kick my ass with their desyncing. Don't even get me started on the barrels either. They are there to give you something to hide from a dream in, but they've all got the desync problems the dreams themselves have, which doesn't make them very viable regardless of your ping. Since desync ultimately cannot be fixed even for people who live close to the servers, and the maze is already annoying enough without the broken dreams, I'd advocate for removing them from standard mode, or at the very least reducing their width so you can hug a wall and still be fine. That would make it a lot more standard, I guess, and I am sure the players would appreciate that. I did want to briefly mention the tokens. These are extremely important, and there's no way a first timer with no knowledge is going to know how they work, which can throw runs and gets their teammates mad to where they leave. And I think it's an interesting part of challenge mode, and as a raider I think it's neat, but the average player is not going to feel the same way, and average players are who the devs need to cater to with standard mode. And just to mention, the 2 school wheels are based on the secondary school of their respective bosses, and the wildlife and astral wheels will appear after the bosses die. You've got to call them out when they spawn to avoid confusion, because if someone picks it up and doesn't remember what it was, then they have to guess, and that can often lead to having to respawn the bosses and fight them all over again. Best case, they scrap this idea entirely in standard mode and just let people turn on the pumps whenever, as long as both bosses are dead. 5th on the list are the Dreamwater spills. There's a total of 27 locations where they could spawn, and you and your team have to navigate the maze again with all of those damn broken dreams seeking to you and trying to corner you. You'll need to find a total of 12 Dreamwater to get rid of the minions at Malice in the middle of the maze. Because if any of them are alive when you begin the fight, you get Who Now Meteored, and that's the run over because you can't dungeon recall for some reason. For standard mode, keeping the controversial auto loss condition in doesn't feel very standard, and even though the minions basically don't have health, at least letting them be alive without it costing you the run would help new players immensely. My 6th and final point here is the Malice fight itself. Never have I seen such an artificially annoying fight in my 13 years playing this game. On top of being able to use Lava Lord and Fiery Giant, both of which taking moons to play out with animation time, and also put an extra 35 mantles on you, he can cheat cast the following at the beginning of the turn, and I've ranked them by how common they've been in my experience. I've done 21 runs on my myth so far. He can cast, most commonly, Black Mantle, AoE 55%. Second, Muzzle. It's an AoE 25% weakness and 45% mantle, which is arguably the worst out of these 6. Choke, which is the AoE stun, a 95% Ifrit on the lowest health player. The Beguile version of Monster Mash, the Chain Von Chain uses for his cheat in Darkmoor, on the highest health player, and 6th and least common in my experience has been his 90% Tower Shield. The first 2 are by far the most common, happening nearly every round, and if he throws out the aforementioned Lava Lord or Fiery Giant, it's a good chance you get stacked mantles, meaning it is nowhere near safe to try to hit that next turn. And I'd give it probably a 25% chance per round that you even get a turn to breathe and apply buffs without a mantle. And his aura that he also just applies randomly will also completely negate damage if it's up when you hit, so you have to target him with anything to get him to take it off. That part's honestly not hard. Ideally, you have someone with a lot of myth accuracy to use Shatter to do that. But again, that's real specific, and not every team is going to have someone like that. I was streaming yesterday, and somebody in my chat, a regular viewer, Gonzalo, he said, it's gotten to the point where I've created a rule for myself. I won't go into the nightmare without a myth, and that is totally understandable because shatter matters a lot. You know, if he puts on that minus 90% tower shield on the round that you hit, that's the run shocked. Overall though, this standard mode doesn't feel very standard. Using team up isn't exactly the best thing to do since it's a roll of the dice as to how good your team's going to be, and a lot of people experience the same old quote unquote I don't want to play with noobs type people, and they leave, so you're down a player, and it's a whole thing. Standard mode really needs some nerfs in the right places. I think the health on the bosses can stay since it is an endgame dungeon, but the annoying aspects that make people leave, like the broken dreams, mantle spam, having to find the pumps, etc., really should stay exclusive to challenge mode as opposed to standard. But that's just my take. So, thank y'all for watching. I've been Ice Gold. Be sure to like, subscribe, and leave like 50 comments for the algorithm. My Discord is down in the description if you want to chat with me some more. I'll see y'all later.